Before sunrise on June 22, 1944, a Soviet Guards mortar battery rolled into a tree line on the edge of the Belarusian marshes. 4 trucks stopped beneath the branches. On each truck bed sat 16 steel launch rails. The command came in less than 10 seconds. 64 rockets tore into the German forward line. Then the forest went quiet, not because the Germans had answered, because the Soviet crews were already gone. The rails were empty, the engines were turning, and by the time German observers traced the smoke back to the launch point, the battery was miles away. The weapon was the Katyusha. The Germans called it Stalin's organ, after the rows of rails and the terrifying shriek of the rockets. But beneath one of the most famous Soviet weapons of the war sat a machine almost nobody remembers. An American truck. A Studebaker US6 built in South Bend, Indiana, passed over as the standard truck of the United States Army, then shipped east in enormous numbers. The rockets were Soviet. The launcher was Soviet. The crews were Soviet. But the machine that let them fire, escape, and fire again was American. And in the summer of 1944, that combination helped carry the Red Army through the offensive that destroyed German Army Group Center. The Studebaker did not look historic. It was a 2.5-ton cargo truck with 3 driven axles, a 6-cylinder gasoline engine, and a governed road speed of about 45 miles per hour. No armor, no gun, no glamorous silhouette. Soviet drivers called it the Studer. They also overloaded it relentlessly. 5 tons was not unusual, nearly twice its rated cargo weight, and the truck kept moving over roads that often existed only on a map. Mud, snow, ruts, shell holes, broken bridges, fields churned into black paste by tanks and horses. The Studer's value was brutally simple. It went where it was ordered, and it came back. The word often attached to this truck is rejected. That word needs precision. The United States Army did not test the US-6 and decide it was worthless. It standardized on another 2.5-ton 6x6, the GMC CCKW, for its own main fleet. Studebaker had built a truck to a very similar military requirement, but once the American Army chose its standard, the US-6 was pushed toward export. It became a truck built in America for other armies to fight from. The Soviet Union received roughly 152,000 of them through Lend-Lease. That number matters. Not because every Studebaker carried rockets. Most did not. They hauled fuel, ammunition, food, bridging equipment, infantry, radios, artillery crews, spare parts, and wounded men. But by 1944, the Studebaker had become one of the most important vehicles in the Red Army's motor pool. Soviet factories were producing tanks, assault guns, artillery, and aircraft under crushing pressure. American trucks filled a different gap. They gave the Red Army wheels. And those wheels had traveled farther than almost any vehicle on the front. Many Studebakers crossed the Atlantic, entered the Persian Gulf, and were assembled or unloaded at ports in Iran. From there, American, Soviet, and Iranian personnel moved them north through the Persian corridor toward the Caucasus. A truck that began in Indiana might be driven across Persia, transferred near the Soviet border, sent through the Caucasus, and finally arrive in Belarus or Ukraine. By the time it reached a rocket battery, the truck had already crossed half a world. The question is why this ordinary cargo vehicle became the preferred platform for the Katyusha. The answer begins with what the launcher had been forced to ride before it. The Katyusha entered combat long before the Studebaker arrived in strength. On July 14, 1941, an experimental battery commanded by Captain Ivan Flerov fired one of the first combat salvos near the rail junction at Orsha. His 7 BM-13 launchers were mounted on Soviet ZS-6 trucks. The strike was violent, sudden, and unlike the measured rhythm of ordinary artillery. 2 salvos put roughly 112 rockets into the target area. The new weapon had announced itself, but the truck under it was already exposing the problem. The ZS-6 drove only 4 of its 6 wheels, on a hard road that was manageable. On the Eastern Front, hard roads were a temporary condition. The spring thaw turned roots into rivers of mud. Autumn did it again. Winter buried roads under snow and ice. Retreating armies destroyed bridges, cratered junctions, and abandoned wreckage in every lane. The Katyusha could deliver a devastating salvo, but if its truck bogged down after firing, the launcher became a target. And German counter-battery fire did not need long. Once observers saw the flash, smoke, and flight path, they could begin working backward toward the launch position. A Katyusha battery survived by being somewhere else before the answer arrived. That made mobility part of the weapon. Not support, not convenience, part of the weapon itself. Flerov's battery learned the cost of capture in the first desperate months of the invasion. In October 1941, cut off near Vyazma, the battery destroyed its own launchers rather than let them fall into German hands. Flerov did not survive the breakout. The Katyusha was born Soviet, fired first from a Soviet truck, and was protected as a state secret at the cost of the men who operated it. What the Studebaker added later was not the fire, it was survival after the fire. Six-driven wheels gave the US6 traction the ZI6 could not match. Its reliability meant a battery could reach a prepared firing point, launch and displace without losing trucks to breakdowns. Its standardized parts meant mechanics could learn one engine, one drivetrain, one electrical system, one set of failures. That sounds mundane. In war, mundane systems decide whether elite weapons remain elite. Before the US6 became standard, Soviet rocket units used a mixture of domestic trucks, tractors, and several Lend-Lease chassis. Every extra truck type created another list of spare parts, another maintenance manual, another reason a damaged launcher might sit useless because the depot had the wrong component. Standardization reduced that chaos. One chassis, one maintenance system, one truck mechanics could repair in darkness under camouflage, with artillery somewhere beyond the horizon. In April 1943, the normalized BM-13N launcher was standardized on the Studebaker chassis. From then on, the truck and launcher were treated as a single system. By the end of the war, about 1,800 BM-13N launchers had been built on the US6. Older Katyushas on Soviet and other chassis did not disappear overnight. But for new production, the Studebaker had become the answer. Now look at what it carried. The BM-13 mounted 16 rails for 16 132mm rockets. A full salvo left in seconds. Reloading took roughly 3 to 4 minutes by hand. The rockets could reach about 5.5 miles, but they were not precision weapons. Each rocket scattered more than a shell fired from a rifled gun. A single rocket against a single point target was a poor wager. A battery against an area was something else entirely. 4 launchers firing together put 64 rockets into the air in 7 to 10 seconds. The rockets arrived across a broad footprint in one violent pulse. Blast, fragments, smoke, shock. The inaccuracy was not removed. It was organized. The Katyusha turned dispersion into saturation, and it added a psychological effect no calculation table could fully measure. Tube artillery often arrived in a pattern soldiers could recognize. The Katyusha announced itself with a rising scream, then dropped an entire salvo almost at once. Soviet crews gave the launcher an affectionate name taken from a popular song. German troops gave it a name born from fear, Stalin's organ. The sound reached men before the blast did. That was the second warhead, but the launcher paid for its violence with vulnerability. No armor protected the crew. The rockets had to be reloaded in the open. The truck bed, rails, and ammunition made a conspicuous target. If the battery remained in place for those 3 or 4 minutes, it risked being found and destroyed. So the doctrine was built around motion. Scout the firing point, move in, align, fire everything. Leave immediately. A battery might displace 3 or 4 miles before reloading. The faster it vanished, the better its chance of firing again. The rocket supplied the shock. The Studebaker supplied the escape. That relationship became even more important when Soviet rocket artillery grew heavier. The same US6 chassis carried the BM-3112, nicknamed the Andreyusha. Instead of 16 132mm rockets, it carried 12 much larger 300mm rockets with heavier warheads and shorter range. It entered service in June 1944. The month matters, because that was the month the Red Army opened Operation Bagration. By the summer of 1944, the Guard's mortar units were no improvised curiosity. They were elite formations, controlled carefully and concentrated, where the Soviet High Command wanted sudden, overwhelming fire. Their task was not to replace conventional artillery. It was to add something conventional artillery could not deliver in the same instant. A wall of rockets arriving across an area before defenders could recover from the first impact. That was exactly the kind of violence Bagration was designed to use. The offensive began on June 22, 1944, 3 years to the day after Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Its target was Army Group Center in Belarus. The Germans held a vast salient, a forward bulge hundreds of miles wide. A bulge can be pushed backward, or it can be cut at the shoulders and crushed from the sides. The Soviet plan was not to move Army Group Center. It was to make Army Group Center cease to exist. 4 Soviet fronts prepared the blow. Konstantin Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian Front in the south, Ivan Chernyakovsky's 3rd Belarusian Front, the 2nd Belarusian Front in the center, Hovhannes Bagramyan's 1st Baltic Front in the north. Before the attack, the Soviets concealed the scale of the buildup with Maskirovka, military deception. Visible tank forces remained farther south to suggest the main offensive would come through Ukraine. False radio traffic supported the story. Real formations moved at night. Engineers laid timber tracks across marshes. Men, guns, ammunition, fuel, and trucks entered assembly areas under camouflage and silence. This was not secrecy performed by a few spies. It was logistics performed without being seen. And the truck fleet mattered at every step. A deception plan fails if units arrive late, if fuel cannot reach them, or if artillery cannot move into place before the enemy notices. Among tens of thousands of Soviet vehicles, the Studebaker helped turn hidden concentration into physical reality. Then came the bombardment. Thousands of conventional guns opened fire. The Katyushas were a smaller part of that arsenal, and the difference matters. Tube artillery delivered most of the sustained weight. It cut wire, smashed bunkers, destroyed command posts, and kept German positions under continuous pressure. The rocket launchers added concentrated pulses of saturation and shock. They were not the entire hammer. They were the blow inside the hammer that arrived all at once. Across the breakthrough sectors, the combined bombardment overwhelmed German forward positions. Ammunition stores erupted. Communications failed. Bunkers collapsed. Men who survived the barrage emerged into a battlefield whose organization had been torn apart. The Red Army did not win Bagration because of one weapon. It won because guns, rockets, infantry, armor, engineers, deception, and logistics were concentrated toward the same purpose. The Katyusha fit that method perfectly. Mass fire, delivered fast, at the exact place the front needed to break. And once the line broke, the truck underneath became even more valuable. A stationary breakthrough is only a hole. An advancing army turns it into collapse. At Vitebsk, German formations were encircled. At Bobruisk, more troops were trapped and destroyed. East of Minsk, Soviet pincers closed around much of the German Fourth Army. The German command structure disintegrated with the divisions it was trying to control. Roughly 28 divisions of Army Group Center were destroyed as effective formations. German losses across the operation are commonly placed somewhere between 400,000 and 540,000 killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Numbers that large become difficult to imagine, so picture the map instead. A front that had held Belarus for years moved west hundreds of miles in weeks. Minsk fell on July 3. Soviet forces drove onward toward the Vistula and the approaches to Warsaw. By the time the advance slowed in August, it had covered roughly 370 miles in places. That speed created its own crisis. Fuel columns had to find roads that no longer existed. Ammunition had to cross rivers behind armies already fighting on the far bank. Bridges had to carry tanks, artillery, ambulances, and trucks without rest. The faster the Red Army moved, the farther every gallon, shell, loaf, and spare part had to travel. This is where the Studebaker's real story becomes larger than the rocket launcher. The US6 under a Katyusha helped the battery fire and escape. The other 150,000 Studebakers helped the entire army keep moving. They pulled guns, carried shells, moved infantry, delivered fuel, recovered broken vehicles, brought engineers to rivers and food to men who had outrun their field kitchens. The famous launcher was only the most visible load. The truck's deeper contribution was momentum. A broken enemy can recover if pursuit slows. Bagration did not give Army Group Center time to recover. Guards' mortar batteries moved with the advance, took new firing positions, and launched against the next improvised German line. The same logic repeated at every scale. Fire, move, fire again. At the level of one battery, that rhythm saved crews from counter-battery fire. At the level of an entire front, it turned a breakthrough into the destruction of an army group. And that is why the Studebaker matters. Not because it made the Katyusha Soviet-American, it did not. The launcher, rockets, doctrine, crews, and combat use were Soviet. The truck was a tool. But it was a tool matched so perfectly to the weapon's weakness that it became part of the weapon's strength. The popular memory of the Katyusha often hides that relationship. Not because the Soviet Union concealed it during the war. Soviet officials praised the quality of the Studebaker. The truck was openly valued. Drivers respected it. The Red Army used it everywhere it could. The forgetting came later. During the Cold War, national war memories hardened. In the Soviet story, the Katyusha became a pure symbol of Soviet ingenuity and sacrifice. In Western memory, the Eastern Front itself shrank, and the scale of Lend-Lease trucks disappeared with it. The rails stayed in the legend. The chassis faded out. But the truck left marks that memory could not erase. Studebakers remained in Soviet service into the 1950s, with some surviving longer. Their design influenced post-war Soviet trucks. Drivers called the US6 the king of roads. The name Studebaker itself became a byword for something tough. None of that happened because the truck was glamorous. It happened because men trusted it underweight, in mud at night, while the front was moving and the enemy was trying to kill them. Somewhere in Belarus in the summer of 1944, a guard's mortar crew fired 16 rockets in a few seconds. The launcher shook. Smoke swallowed the trees. The men dropped into the cab. The Studebaker clawed through the mud and vanished before German shells reached the firing point. The rockets were Soviet, the battle was Soviet, the victory was Soviet. But the wheels that carried Stalin's organ out of danger had been built in South Bend, Indiana, and shipped halfway around the world so the weapon could survive its own fire.